mean, I want to start by asking you a question that is on the minds of anyone who has been reading this book. What are we going to do about Vincent de Courcy O'Regan? Could you answer this, please?
Yeah, so for me personally, I don't particularly like Vincent, and I think Agnes can do better. And I think there's a lot of things. I think Kate O'Brien is really interesting in how there's such a parallel between Reggie and Vincent, that both of them are kind of stunted emotionally and spiritually and imaginatively. And so that kind of regression is sort of symbolized with their relationships with mothers, that it seems like neither of them can finish or move on. But I think maybe what disturbed me about Vincent a little bit was there's a discussion about when he first was courting Marie Rose and the intensity and the passion and how it consumed him. And you wonder, is his love for Agnes just a repetition of self-indulgence? And his detachment is, he keeps seeing himself outside himself as if he's watching a play, and the kind of performative things that are happening. It almost, I felt like sometimes that he himself is posing, even though he says people accuse him of that. But there's one thing that really bothered me, and I thought that there was a hint of violence or a hint of some kind of, not necessarily physical violence, but how he treats Marie Rose. And I'm just a line on quite early in the book. But his wife had to suffer the hysterical reactions from this outward insolence, as well as the deeper and more cruel vengeance, which he had no will to practice on her, but which decreasing self-control released in spite of him. And you're wondering, what is that exactly? What's happening that we don't know, and why? And Marie Rose wants to come home, and she also seems to be regressing and wanting to be back in the fold of family and back in her childhood room with her sister. So I'm not sure Vincent did something about himself for us, but and even that act at the end, it would be interesting to see what people thought about how this book ends, because I know there's a lot of conflicted feelings about, even Kate O'Brien second-guessed herself at the end of her career about, she thought it was her best book, but wasn't sure it was the right ending or not.
It must have been really hard to write. Because how far, if you're going, are we giving the plot away, by the way?
Don't everyone is...
Yes. No, but there might be someone who's on 2 pages away and you think, oh my Lord, you've just destroyed my day. So, it must have been tempting to have him put the gun down and walk back into the house. Surely. What would you do?
I was just reading, in my version, Deirdre Madden has the afterword is in it, and she sort of feels that the ending is melodramatic and maybe not necessary. And I think a lot of other critics have thought about that. But I think Kate O'Brien, I don't know that it was so much that I think she was sort of looking at a kind of dead end, what Irish society in the bigger picture was doing to people, and the kind of claustrophobia and insularity. And maybe even that the relationship, I'm thinking about Agnes, she falls in love with her brother-in-law, and you just sort of wonder, has she really gotten to see many men? In The Tempest with Miranda, who's never seen men, humans, and a brave new world that has such creatures in it, and 'tis new to thee, because she hasn't seen anything yet. And I had that feeling about Agnes, that society and the way in which women are kind of forced into a kind of domesticity, these domestic spaces, that she really hasn't had a chance to meet other men, because the parties are all over, her mother is dying, and they're all in this stasis. So I thought, I just wondered if Kate O'Brien, that having Vincent take his own life at the end was sort of talking about, in a bigger picture, a kind of dead end. And some people say, well, what are the alternative plot options? The marriage plot has, this is a failed marriage plot or romance plot. What are the other options? but I think maybe she was sort of maybe pointing out something else.
I wonder if that what you're saying about her not meeting many men, her not seeming to have many options, is actually key to the book in that this house is an island. It isn't as though there's a society. What Kate O'Brien is trying to do, no one has really tried before, which is to create a novel of the Irish upper middle classes who are Catholics, and to give the Catholicism an enormous amount of force in the book, but also to give their morals and manners a sort of treatment that Ibsen might have given his characters, or John Galsworthy in England. In other words, the entire Irish 19th century, if you look at the novels, is filled with, if there's a mirror, it's broken. If there's glass, if there's a window, someone horrible is looking in the window to see what they can do. You know, in other words, in William Carleton, Wild Goose Lodge, of course the house is going to be set on fire. You know, in Maria Edgeworth's, you know, in Castle Rackrent, you know, it is that the entire place is going to ruin, and the nasty one is going to take over. That there's no chance that in an Irish novel of the 19th century you could have a Jane Austen house in which there's a house, a garden, parkland, and then a vast amount of valuable agricultural land bringing in 10,000 a year, and in which, which is possible for one house to visit another and have a dance without someone kicking someone, insulting someone, using very bad language, or deciding to burn the place down or get drunk. And so that Kate O'Brien has nothing to work on except an English tradition where it's filled with servants and, but there would be another house nearby of the same sort of people who would visit regularly and would have visitors, and suddenly Mr. Bingley, as in, would rent a house nearby, and Agnes would be told there's a new man renting the house nearby, and so the two houses could merge. But in this book, there's an incredible sense of loneliness, of utter isolation, which begins, I think, as a political isolation, that I hesitate to say it, and I didn't say it, deny it later, but I wonder if Kate O'Brien, writing in 1934, is trying to work out, how did Fine Gael get like that? Who became Fine Gael? And, that idea of a growing Irish middle class, in other words, that Teresa, if she's, this is 1880, and if she's, say, 60, has to have lived through the famine. And what Kate O'Brien is desperate to do is to keep all this misery, this Irishness. There's no one called Mick, there's no one called Murphy. He's called Vincent de Courcy O'Regan, for God's sake, and Nurse Considine. Even Mulqueen, which is a Gaelic name, but nonetheless, it's in English, it sounds grander, perhaps, than it is. But that there is a sense of trying to create a sort of Catholic grandeur. And you can feel the strain. I don't know if you can. I mean, can you feel the strain that I'm talking about in that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, reading it, I do have that sense of like the Jane, Austen drawing room, and and an incredible isolation. I mean, Agnes talks about she has to think about Vincent because she doesn't have her own thoughts. She doesn't have her own things to think about. I mean, how isolating that is. But I also, I guess from, in terms of the outer world, or her effort to show us this Catholic middle class, and to me it just seemed really destructive, and maybe everything is dying from the very beginning of the book, from the opening moments. The town is shrouded in mist. There's an elegiac air that carried a shroud of mist is one of the lines. You just get the sense of there's something already dead even before it's ever really actually happened. The world seems empty. And I loved so much of this book is about this tension between the visible and the invisible, because nothing actually happens that much, so much as in the heads. And I guess maybe that reinforces our sense of their inability to act or to bring change or to affect something. They all just seem to be, I love that chapter in the book 2 where Agnes is eating grapes at the start.
Yeah.
And then you have the whole thing at the table and all the things that people are, the cruelties and judgments that are being made and the deep desires. And then it comes back to she's eating grapes. Like the whole chapter has happened.
Yeah, it circles around back to the grapes.
All, the internal lives versus the constraints of the external world.
I think the book is also, it represents the ambiguities and the tensions within Kate O'Brien's own imagination and her own experience in life. In other words, that she was fascinated by religion, that she wrote a book about St. Teresa of Avila, that she loved that Spain, that Castile that was filled with the almost the smell of the Inquisition, and that her aunts were nuns, and she wrote a book called Presentation Parlour about them as nuns, and yet she herself was a lesbian. And that she had a whale of a time, and she was also a great bohemian figure, and that those two things in her, didn't merge. They were in conflict, and there's a sense in the novel sometimes of a great mischief, which you feel in Ulysses sometimes, so that Joyce is really enjoying himself, making a feck of things that other people think are really serious. And for example, you'd get, let's set a novel. For example, her novel, The Land of Spices, let's make it about a nun, a very powerful Reverend Mother, a very serious figure, about her spiritual life. But let's go back in her childhood. This is why the book was banned. When she goes back in her childhood, and a nun remembers that one day she came home early from school and she found her father in his study. Kate O'Brien loves fathers having studies. I mean, did anyone here's father have a study? She goes up to the study and she comes in very quietly and finds her father and this other man in the embrace of love. And you go, wow, the nun. And of course, someone underlined the embrace of love, sent it to the censorship board, who instantly banned the book for those words, the embrace of love. And here you have, okay, we're going to set it over these 3 days. Which we call Halloween, but they call All Souls, All Saints, and the Eve of All Souls. And let's give the son syphilis. And let's have the daughter being crazy about her sister's husband. I mean, let's just cause as much trouble in this household as Mass is going to be said constant in the bedroom. The brother is a priest, the sister's a nun. Benediction, there's a constant confession. People are always praying, but in the middle of the whole thing, there are these two facts that won't leave the novel alone, and that she's having sort of a tremendously good time, not bringing the two things together, but actually trying to tear these souls asunder. With, on one hand, their sort of religiosity, and on the other hand, their extraordinary desires or their sort of sexual presences in 1934 in Ireland.
Yeah, I love how she said it over those 3 days, like structurally, and in fact, I don't know if it was typical, but like the first chapter, I was like, is this supposed to be like the glorious mysteries or something that you felt like you were like, the pace of it. But when Teresa is praying and she's thinking about it being the eve of All Saints, she starts trying to do the glorious mysteries and immediately just starts thinking about Halloween and how fun it was. And I love that there's this kind of like this little kind of pagan or, this other force that is an undercurrent. So there's like, they have all this like ritual and structure, but there's something else breaking through, which is like desire and the yearning body and all these things that the church at this point in our, at the time that it was written in 1934, was all that was about to, that was the thing that had to be controlled, and things like motherhood and marriage had to be, enshrined in the Constitution, and, the church was about controlling the body. And Dr. Curran, that's his whole thing. Isn't Catholicism great? Because, it puts the human animal, it checks them, keeps them in their place, it stops desire. And so there's this tension all the time between like, control and want, which I think she does really, really brilliantly.
Yeah. I wonder if part of the book arises from the quality of passion in the book, that the levels of feeling are so strong, so high, and that you must control them all the time from moving into melodrama and remaining, within the possible. So there's a real problem, I think, for any novelist putting a woman in bed for all the novel. Will she get up? Will she die? Like, what will she do? What will she? Like, she's in bed, and but by having one thing only on her mind, how is Reggie going to live if I die? And by making that into a single passionate feeling that she has in order to keep alive, that is why the woman is in the bed in the novel, because she is deeply engaged with this idea. And I think that moves us over to Agnes, whose passion for Vincent is really enormous, and obviously it's irrational, but it means a great deal to her. While I think what you're saying about Vincent to her, there's an element of brutality in his feelings always, but hers for him, there is an element of something pure and serious, and that we must take seriously as readers. In how is that right?
Yeah, there's so much given over to it, and I think because we are inside her consciousness so much, like we do, it's an omniscient narration that goes in and out of the different characters, but I never think we are as deeply in a character as we are with Agnes in terms of her real internal conflict. And because she all the time is trying to negotiate that and question it. So she goes to confession, and I'm like, whoa, she tells the priest, like, I fancy my brother-in-law. And, you're just like, that's...
He's a good limit Jesuit, yeah.
And he, accepts it and sort of, and then his line about, this is about, that's just finite, and, you could have eternal love, and I love when later on in the book she's just like, it's pretty difficult to do that when you gave us this form, like we have bodies, and so that's all well and good, but we have no idea how to negotiate ideas or eternity when we have our human bodies that want. And so, I think that with Agnes we feel the intensity of her passion because we hear her whole self-admonishment, the self-loathing, inability, to control it. And even when she goes out and meets him that night, and I don't know, you're like, no, like, don't.
Don't go, don't. Yeah.
Inside, it's messy.
Yeah, the nurse is going to be watching from the window.
Yeah, and actually, because I'd love to talk about...
we're coming to her. Yeah.
But and that moment, because I know a lot of people, in fact, Deirdre Madden mentions just that kind of moment, that embrace, and between the two of them, where they're you get the sense of they're united. I think maybe I was a little bit more because what are they going to do? Conduct an affair until where Peter's out. I think his suggestion of that they take off together, and you kind of know that these aren't really available options, particularly because she's carrying with her all of her Catholic sensibility, which she is the servant of her family. Her entire life. I mean, when Marie Rose says to her, "You need to get that floorboard fixed," I was like, she's doing everything. Agnes is doing everything, and the sister comes home and is like, that there's a creak in the floorboard. You should get that fixed. Yeah. You kind of start to feel her frustration.
I think for any Irish novelist, there's always a problem what to do with dialogue. That if you try and put too much Irish flavour into dialogue, you actually, the reader, especially the Irish reader, sort of cringes and thinks, could you just get on with the story and stop trying to make us, make Irish people talk like people never do. And one of the things you can do is you can use this after thing, in making the past tense. He's after being sick. And that's Irish usage. And if you do it once, don't do it twice. And it's interesting to watch here that the characters here, some of the conversation, the dialogue, especially that last love scene, is so stilted. They really talk as though what Yeats talked about, saying that his characters use a living speech. This seems like they speak in a sort of dead speech that Kate O'Brien is giving them, having sort of lost Limerick. That where are we in Limerick? Could we possibly be in Limerick? And there are a few interesting moments where the older generation, where Teresa, for example, in one moment says, nonsense, it's too much quiet you have, run down, let you. Run down, let you. And I can hear her, but Agnes doesn't do it, and her other daughter, Mary, help me.
Mary Rose.
Mary Rose doesn't do it. And there's another thing. I marked it a few times, where she says, "I'm afraid I'm late. I'm sorry, Mother. It's to your father you should be saying that, and he waiting for his breakfast, I suppose. I don't know how this house is going at all these times." And you think, oh, well, I think I know where she got that. That's called, an Irish writer's version of Irish speech. And what then I think the golden rule for Irish writing, please obey this rule, is never let a Brit into your novel if your characters are Irish. Just don't let an English person in. If you can let a Yank in, it's not so much trouble, but if you let an English person in, you're going to have to immediately start dealing with the difference of speech, the difference of sound, the difference of temperament, and the sort of funny watching each other as though across a great divide. And I mean, when Sir Geoffrey Bartlett Crowe comes down on the train, like he crosses Ireland on a train, you just think, oh my God, how much were they paying him? I mean, how do you get a doctor like that to come across? So this was not the first time Sir Godfrey had condescended to travel his eminent opinion as far as Dublin. And of course, where he asked to attend any of the great historic houses scattered about the district called the Pale, he would not hesitate to pursue his guineas even there. King O'Brien's having immense fun, pursue his guineas even there. But to plunge right into the murderous and stormy South. This is even before Béal na Blá, like the murderous and stormy South, to stay in the home of a real Irishman, a Catholic, to attend the wife of a small-town merchant and waste 24 hours, and perhaps encounter danger in so doing. That, at first blush, had seemed an absurd suggestion. And you think, she's really enjoying bringing him in because, of course, he then thinks Mary Rose is so exquisitely beautiful. And, of course, there's a wonderful moment where poor old Agnes has to worry about the sort of quality of the wines and the cigars, that giving some tranquilizing advice to her father on the subject of wines and cigars, because the Englishman is going to really notice. And so there is an element of social comedy in the way the Mulqueens are putting themselves forward to the world, and the world being the Dublin doctor and the eminent Brit doctor. So there is a world outside let in, but it's let in only to inspect the house. It isn't anything else, really, is it?
So just that moment, Sir Godfrey says, in just a little bit after that, Marie Rose says that Agnes is one of the new types, that she's disillusioned. And then he said, but I thought that Ireland suffered no new types. I thought it was the sanctuary of the old ideal feminine. So it's like he wants to come down the country and see, the Irish Colleen, it's exactly how, in all her purity, and these stereotypes that even the English are bringing over about the Irish, ideal Irish woman. I actually thought Kate O'Brien was having a lot of fun with all the male. I mean, yes. Dr. William Curran is, his ideas about women, basically to despise, he basically despises women. And he wasn't going to marry a beauty because, then there might be someone more beautiful. And so that would be just too much for him, so you have this picture of civility, that he's this reasonable, rational, he's the doctor. And we keep getting these lines like the doctor in him. And then you hear what he says and you're like, are we just absorbing this and not going what? His attitudes. And so his attraction for Agnes is a little bit hard. I don't doubt that he loves her, but I think when he's abroad, he likes to enjoy himself. But when he comes home, he's continent. Now, I actually looked that up. Am I reading this correctly? So he likes to have a good time when he's away. But when he's at home, he believes in being he believes it's a good thing. And so you're kind of like, okay, what is she's having I think she's having a go at the kind of men that she probably saw sitting around a table of an evening and is making a caricature of them.
The father, Danny, we don't see him much in Irish literature, but I think we do see him in Irish life. He's one of those fellows who just sort of sits there. And he often has a proverb to add to the whole occasion. He loves his wife, he loves his daughters, he loves God. And he's worried about Captain Boycott, and he's puzzled by Parnell, and he gets all this money, obviously, from land which he must own. But he really is a pretty comic. It's a picture worthy of Jane Austen, isn't it? Of the sort of ineffectual father sort of sitting there.
The fat sobbing man. No, the only reason she recognizes the kind of corpse of Teresa in the bed is because of the fat sobbing figure beside it, and you're like, woo. You know, he's kind of been reduced to like, you know, something quite
Pathetic?
Pathetic.
Pathetic?
Yeah. And he is. I mean, those lines where he says, "Oh, Teresa, speak to me, please," because all she talks about is Reggie. And like the way she's displaced her husband for the love of her son. So I think I think of all the men in the book, I probably have the most empathy for him. For Danny O'Queen. I think he, you know, he's lost something, and you know, he's trying to do the right thing and be good to everyone. But he's ineffectual.
But isn't she, Kate O'Brien, fascinated by painting these men in very grey tones? She won't give them much colour, and she won't give them, I think, a lot of texture or the same sort of ambiguity and presence that she gives, for example, Agnes, or even Teresa in bed.
Yeah, and it's kind of incredible, like as you were saying earlier about Teresa is in bed for the duration, and like she never, like, I guess this is a book where everything's truncated, like lives are truncated in some way, like she doesn't even get to die. And I mean, I don't think she dies.
No, she doesn't know.
So,
no.
Like, even that doesn't happen, and the way like Reggie can never finish the Chopin piece, like no one's ever finishing, you know, anything. But she, in the end, when Agnes looks at her face and sees her mother's happy and more alive than she is, there's more life in her mother. And in fact, Nurse Cunningham says that as well, that there's still a lot of life force in Teresa, but Agnes is sort of spiritually dead. And I mean, that is her last moment. We finish with Agnes at that point where she says, I'm dying. And then I think she says, "Oh, Vincent, darling." That might be the last line. But and then Vincent gets the last chapter.
In Maria Edgeworth's novel, Castle Rackrent, written at the beginning of the 19th century, it's narrated by Thady. And it's about the decay of the family of the Rackrents, who are great sort of landlords, Protestant aristocrats who live in London, come and go. But we watch slowly as Jason, Thady's son, who's a Catholic, is slowly building up money, enough capital, and he's going to get the house. He's going to get Castle Rackrent. So the novel is going to show in 3 generations how this family decays, but there's someone else waiting. And here we have exactly the same story being told. This really is the last season that these people will be able to live in this house in this way, because something new is coming. Because bringing a nurse into a novel is very good, because a nurse is oddly classless if he or she is working in a house. In other words, she has her own sitting room. She eats mainly in her sitting room, but she can come to the main table. That she has a sort of a 2 positions socially. She's almost a servant, and she's almost one of the family. And so that we watch her slowly taking over, and we realize by the end of the season, by the following year, she will be running this house, and Agnes will be out. Her sister will no longer be able to visit, and the father will be even more ineffectual in the corner, and the mother will be dead. But the person who will prevail is a person in a class below these people who comes in with nothing except her skill as a nurse. And so we're actually watching social change.
And I think what's interesting, because Under My Cloak, the book that precedes the first novel, Kate O'Brien's first novel, is actually the story of Teresa Considine's family from being horse rustlers, basically, to becoming merchants, middle-class merchants. So, you know, we see their rise, and maybe, you know, something that's preceding their fall. I thought the treatment of Nurse Cunningham was so interesting because she's sort of detested. Agnes detests her, and the feeling slightly mutual, I think. And I think the moment where Nurse Cunningham looks at Agnes, it's one moment where we see one woman looking at another woman and sort of taking her down, like, she's too lanky, men don't like that. She's judging her with the way that with the eyes that men would look at her, which I thought was interesting. But ultimately, she has no social prospects. And I kind of, like, I know she's going into a loveless marriage, but she is, I didn't see her as villainous as Agnes sees her.
Yeah, no. I don't think the reader does.
Kind of,
Yeah.
You kind of get it, that this is her chance, and she's actually offering solace, and she knows the circumstances, and there is a kind of sacrifice in a way, but she has no security, and this is her chance to have some level of...
Yeah. I mean, I think we see that in, say, Pride and Prejudice, where Mr. Collins, who's a complete idiot in the novel, but yet the friend of Elizabeth actually marries him because she has no other choice. She's nowhere else to go, and puts up with him because that is what she must do in order to survive. So the sense of that Nurse Cunningham is sacrificing herself, but Kate O'Brien has very cleverly shown that the alternative is awful, that she's to move from house to house in these barren rooms, and that at least with Reggie, she gets to control the entire enterprise, doesn't she?
Yeah, because he's already infantilized. I mean, he can't. He's a baby, and he just needs to be taken care of. And you can see his movement towards the very end. His acceptance of his mother's going is because somebody else has taken the puppet strings, and he's quite happy for that to happen. It's all the characters, like, they all seem somehow to not. They seem to be regressing rather than progressing. Not Nurse Cunningham, because she's, thinking on her feet, but there's something about the Mulqueens that seems to be regressive or bending back.
Yeah. There's at the center of the novel, you feel there's Kate O'Brien writing, and that she's enjoying her own prose style, her own wit, her own way of being able to judge people or let people off the hook. There's a moment at the opening of the 4th chapter where I just got immense pleasure. Luckily, someone soon came into the room as I was reading and said, listen to this, listen to Kate O'Brien on the arrival in the room of Canon Considine. And, that she will begin, although the magenta buttons, which indicated his ecclesiastical status, had only adorned Canon Considine's black silk stock for 7 months, their wearer had the look of a man born to a higher office than they allowed, one whom the gaiters and purple of a bishopric would well become, and who, though for intellectual reasons unlikely to be elected cardinal, would in physique have adorned the sacred college. I just can see her really, really realizing, I have a beautiful sentence coming. And it's going to be about a Canon Considine. And I felt very much, I don't know how you felt about that very last. Look, she shouldn't go out in the garden. And she should leave him alone out there. He's fine out there. And it's November, he's going to get a cold. And but the scene between the two of them, which goes on, in my view, for too long, reads to me like an opera, like a libretto for an opera, like two lovers in the middle of a long set of arias and duet, and duet sounds, that it doesn't sound like real dialogue to me, but heightened dialogue written for music. And of course, she wrote a novel at the end, the last novel, As Music in Splendor, about opera singers in Paris, and that sort of sound of high singing interested her. But I did feel that with that last sequence, especially the bit you talk about when he says, let's go to Greece, let's have children walking the hills, let's be free with the Adriatic or the Mediterranean. Just think, you think you're singing in an opera, my boy. Yeah.
But I think that comes back to that performative thing. So maybe that's why it feels slightly, of all the moments, the most like melodrama, because it feels slightly performative, or, that he's playing the idea of the lover, and so is she to a certain extent. It's not that I mind love scenes. I just found it slightly over, like you said, maybe over the top a bit. But there's also the separation of time as well, because maybe we don't exactly talk like that anymore. And so some of the dialogue feels stilted for those reasons as well.
Well, I mean, it's 1934, thinking of 1880.
Yeah.
I mean, how did you feel about that?
Yeah, so I think that I love that I feel like she's writing this book at this really interesting moment in Ireland, at this frightening moment in Ireland where, where there was fewer and fewer options for women, and that she puts it back into the 1880s. Maybe, it was a way of talking about, what was happening right then, and that insularity and the impact that would have on lives. And when I think about Kate O'Brien and her life, and just thinking about even in terms of novels and plots that are available to women, marriage plots, the romance plot. This is written like a romance, and the romance plot ends in marriage. And Kate O'Brien at that point was living with another woman we assume in a relationship in England. And so it's, for me, like reading her looking at the 1880s and looking at sort of the dead ends of certain types of plots, like there isn't a happy marriage really in the book. What are the options for an Agnes? And I love that they mention Washington Square, the Henry James novel, because in that novel, there's a young woman who has an inheritance, but she's dull looking, she's plain looking, and everyone knows it and talks about it endlessly, how plain she is. And she gets courted by this man, Morris Townsend, and they get engaged. And her father knows that he's just doing it for the money. So he takes her away for a year, but they continue to write to each other, and she's completely in love with him. And when she comes back, he breaks it off without any explanation. He's been actually living in her house with her aunt. Completely breaks it off, no explanation. She's completely heartbroken. But she goes on and lives a life. And she never marries, but she does all this charitable work, and she has a full life. And at the end, they meet, and he tries to he actually, in a way, tries to be with her. And she won't, she's finished. She won't even have a friendship with him. But they were talking about that book, at the dinner table. And, the men are all just commenting, she's like a fire poker or something. Dull as I've forgotten the exact, but, that you have to, that she's just not colorful enough. And I just wonder about Kate O'Brien, looking at what are the plot options, and how do you write a novel for women that offers something else?
Yeah, I think this is 1934 in conversation with 1880. And part of the reason for 1880, of course, is that there's no cure for syphilis in 1880. And so that you have to have him incurable for the plot to work. Otherwise, the old woman in the bed is, she's having fantasy. So it has to be incurable. But also, I think she wants to get a sort of stability in the family that comes before the Land Acts, that comes before the fall of Parnell. So we can't have that argument. Aunt Dante, who will appear in James Joyce, having big arguments about Parnell. Parnell here is still a figure of wonder. And there's a lovely historical thing where people are still puzzled by what he looks like. And that was how he could function. In other words, it's before newspaper photography was, so that Parnell could travel to Brighton to see, Mrs. O'Shea, without people knowing he was Parnell, which is, for us, an extraordinary idea. But she knows this and puts it in because that's what the conversation is about. Is he tall? Is he small? What does Parnell? What's he like to see? And the other thing is that the 1880 she looks at what's coming out that year, and it's really important. I think that it's not just that Washington Square is coming out. That they're not reading the book. they're reading it being serialized in the Cornhill magazine where it was serialized. In other words, they're full of that business of high culture. What does the daughter sing? She doesn't, if I were doing it, I would have singing one of Moore's melodies. And, no, it's a Schumann song. And the doctor knows the German, but, the German is being mentioned regularly as though we too are in on this business. And it's a way of trying to wash Ireland free of a whole lot of Shannos, the famine, of its later history, of the fall of Parnell, of the church being questioned, of anti-clericalism, that all these things just don't have to be there because the novel is being set in 1880. But because it's 1934, then you can throw in the marriage plot is not possible now. In 1934, this is being questioned. It's interesting that Kate O'Brien reviewed early Samuel Beckett really favourably. That it wasn't as though she was somehow in a different world to the world of Samuel Beckett writing Murphy. She reviewed that book in London. And so she's absolutely alert to the fact that she's subverting a tradition in the novel, which is that, there's not only is there no happy marriage in the book, but there won't be one.
Yeah.
So it is 1934 as much as it's 1880, I think, but there's a dialogue between the two.
Yeah. Ava Walsh talks about in her books that it's like that she brings in a Trojan. It's like she sneaks in a Trojan horse because of that she brings under the civility and grace of her prose. She's sneaking in like all these other things that do subvert or dissent. So whether it's adultery, lesbianism as music and splendor, venereal disease. I don't know what you call loving your brother-in-law, whatever that is. Multiple things.
It's not recommended in this book anyway. Una, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for coming. And